about it earlier as well. I run a social enterprise called On Purpose. We always used to say we develop leaders for social enterprise, which is in part what we do, but we're actually also always broader than that. We more generally have always developed leaders who are trying to integrate social, commercial, and environmental ways of working in kind of in more intelligent ways. And over time, we started realizing that this kind of way of describing ourselves as developing leaders for social enterprise was becoming more and more restrictive and less accurate as to what we were doing. And we went, I guess it was kind of the zeitgeist. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. You know, people were starting to talk about systems change, systems thinking a bit more. And we kind of figured, well, actually, that's really what we do. You know, we're trying to help catalyze a different economic and maybe specifically management system. And we kind of subtly re-articulate what we do. We kind of say that we develop leaders for an economy that works for all, or sometimes we call it a healthy economy. And lots of people were very enthusiastic about that, but there was always invariably a follow-up question, which is, well, that sounds great, but what exactly do you mean by that? So I was very fortunate to be able to go and actually spend some time on a sabbatical, reading up and watching lots of talks about that, about how can we bring about economic systems change, and specifically for me, my interest is at the organizational level. How do organizations have to change to be part of an economy that actually does work and is sustainable and is healthy? And it's really through that, I think, that I started kind of deepening my interest in systems thinking as well, and realizing that for me, the exciting thing is that I believe this is genuinely a kind of seed or something that we can build a genuinely different approach, if you want to use a technical or a big word, a kind of genuinely different paradigm on. You know, our existing paradigm, economic management paradigm, I think is manifestly broken. And I think we can include a lot more understanding of systems in trying to bring about a better kind of paradigm. And the kind of basic definition of a system is actually very simple. If you go to Donella Meadows, who's a well-known systems thinker from kind of starting in the 1970s. She was one of the co-authors of the Rome report. She will say that essentially a system is a group of elements that interact with each other for a purpose. Now that is obviously very wide-ranging. So that, you know, that can include everything from a bacterium, you know, which is made up of elements that are interacting with each other in order, for purpose of keeping that bacterium alive. You can think of your laptop as being a set of elements, including microchips and a keyboard and a screen and so on, interacting with each other for the purpose of performing calculations or maybe allowing you to do some word processing or whatever it might be, all the way through to kind of human beings, which you can think of as essentially a set or a group of cells that, are interacting with each other. Now you can get very philosophical about what is the purpose of life, but let's say it's just to kind of keep that human being alive and keep it simple for now. So in essence, our whole world is made up of systems. And I think maybe just the other thing that I would just emphasize at the minute is that, why is that different, or how is that different from how we traditionally think about things? In our traditional Western kind of scientific engineering approach, starting in the Enlightenment and René Descartes and all the rest of it, what we tend to do is we tend to try and understand things by cutting them up into little pieces. If we want to understand how a machine works, we take it apart and we try and understand each part of that machine. If we try and understand how a human works, we tend to chop it up. We look at an organ, then we look at the cells in the organ, then we go into the cell and we look at the nucleus, and then we kind of get even smaller and we look at the DNA, and then we're trying to understand individual genes, and so we get smaller and smaller, and we try and understand the whole by cutting it up more and more and more. That's our kind of that's our cultural baggage. That's how we've always done that, and that's been incredibly successful for us. But that is actually very different from how systems thinking tends to approach things, because it doesn't include that key word in the definition, which is interact, or if you like, relationship, if we're talking at the kind of human level here. So in our traditional scientific and engineering approach, we tend to not include how things interact with each other and how things influence each other. And this is what systems thinking can help do. It encourages you to see those connections, those relationships, and hence to kind of be able to look at the whole. So sometimes people will talk about holism, which I'm sure you've heard about, which kind of is a very related topic as well.
And what would you say, Tom, just sort of taking it into the current context, and you know, we do hear all sorts of expressions about, you know, it's there's no point changing these small things. At the end of the day, it's the system that's broken, and people refer to systems as almost a reason maybe not to do something, or make something is too big and complex and to be able to pursue an idea. How do you think about that in the way systems are used today in a lot of organizational contexts?
There is obviously a difficulty in that, because it makes it, I think the way it often gets used is that kind of people point to the system as something other, something that I can blame, something that I can kind of point to. You know, another kind of important understanding that comes from systems thinking is that we all have to realize we are all part of the system. The system is not something that is divorced from us or separate from us. We are within that system. We, in how we behave, we influence that system. There's a way of trying to think about systems, which is, you know, a good way to influence systems is just to kind of launch all kinds of little experiments all over the place and see what works. And whatever works, whatever kind of brings you closer to what you're trying to do, amplify that, you know, do more of it. Whatever does the opposite, stop doing that. Because actually the system is probably so big and complicated that it's going to be very difficult for you to anticipate what the reactions of the system are going to be. Hence the need to kind of experiment and to launch something to see what happens, and then kind of go where the energy is.
There's a lot of theory behind system dynamics and systems thinking, but of course, you know, how do you apply that theory into a practical situation and organization? And the language, I think Charles may have mentioned earlier, some of the language used that maybe holds back systems thinking, but also language of systems thinking can hold itself back. So yeah, I look at, I guess at a simplistic level, the idea you mentioned, the parts adding up to the whole. I think the sort of starting at the whole and thinking of the interconnected components, how a feedback loop, for example, that sort of thing becomes quite.
Okay, cool, great. Well, let me throw out kind of maybe half a dozen of these concepts and try and talk through them fairly briefly. And maybe one caveat before going in is that I'm a kind of firm believer that it's useful to see systems thinking not as just a kind of another problem-solving tool. Systems thinking has to be a genuinely different way of kind of seeing the world, or trying to understand the world, a different way of engaging the world. As soon as you are essentially just using it to, I don't know, model what the system is going to do in order to, you know, design a kind of better solution, we're slightly missing the point. So with that kind of maybe challenge or caveat, let's go in. So, you know, some of the things that you will have heard people talk about in systems. So one key part about systems is that people will say, you know, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This is again comes back to this idea that systems interact. The parts in these systems have relationships with each other, and they influence each other. So in kind of systems language, in more technical language, this is referred to as being emergence. So in a system will typically have what's called emergent properties, which are properties that you cannot predict from just looking at the parts of the system, because these emergent properties evolve from the relationships that the parts have with each other. So to make it a little bit more tangible for you, I'm sure you've all seen these kind of videos of murmurations of starlings or murmurations of birds. You know, if you think of a flock of birds being a very simple system, you know, each bird is an element, they relate to each other, they influence each other. But if you look at a flock of birds and the kind of amazing shapes they make in the skies, that is clearly, you know, they are kind of displaying properties that you would never anticipate from just looking at a single bird. But it comes out of each bird's following a set of very simple, in fact, they can reduce it to 3 rules, which are I should fly as quickly as, roughly about as quickly as the birds around about me. I should avoid crashing into any other birds, and I should try and head towards the center of the flock. Those are the only three rules that these birds need, as it were, the only three relationships these birds need to kind of create this emergent properties of these amazing formations that you see in the sky. And that applies to all kinds of other things. Human consciousness is an emergent property of human cells. Our ability to think emerges from the kind of complex interactions that we don't understand well enough of how our cells, and in particular, obviously, our nerve cells interact with each other. So that's kind of one really important thing, that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and we can't predict from the parts what that whole is going to be like, or what all the characteristics of the whole is going to be like. That comes in part, picking up on another word that you said, Murray, feedback loops. Feedback loops you will have heard about as well, especially someone mentioned systems dynamics. Systems dynamics is the part of systems thinking that is particularly, I think it was Charlotte, or maybe Sophie, you probably know more about this than I do, having done a master's in it, but I think of it as kind of being the bit that's preoccupied with modeling systems. And people get very, feedback loops are obviously a very important part of this. Feedback loops occur when you have relationships that either reinforce each other and get bigger and bigger. Classic, holding your microphone towards a speaker and you get suddenly a large blast of noise, or you can have the opposite as well. Feedback loops are what create vibrancy, what create life. If we don't have reinforcing, if we don't have these runaway feedback loops, we would not have life on this earth. But equally, we also need to be able to dampen those runaway feedback loops every now and again as well. So, and again, they are an important part of the emergence that we already mentioned, part of why the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Another kind of very core kind of concept to understand about systems is that systems in nature and just systems in the real world are invariably nested. So you don't really have isolated systems. A system is always a part of another system, is a part of another system, interacts with all kinds of other systems, etc. So when we talk about a system, we always have to draw a boundary around it, just because if you don't, it just becomes too big to talk about. But actually that boundary in some ways is almost invariably slightly artificial. It's a construct that we need to have for us as humans to be able to kind of grasp and think about a particular set of relationships. But in reality, of course, you have these kind of massively nested systems. A human cell is part of human tissue, is part of a human organ, is part of a nervous system, is part of a human, is part of a family, is part of an organization, is part of the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And just as a quick aside, this kind of shows how so much of our economic thinking just does not conform to how the world works. A fundamental assumption of traditional economic thinking is, of course, that the economy is a closed system. By closed system, we mean that there is nothing outside of that system. It doesn't interact with anything else, which is why we have such issues that this apparently, well, actually not, but what we assume to be a closed system is creating all kinds of issues for the systems outside of that system, namely our society and nature, because we make all kinds of unrealistic assumptions about nature being infinite and so on.
Just on that last one, I kind of think of the sort of nested system idea as every subsystem, if you want to call it, has a kind of permeable membrane, and that could be in an organization where it's a team who considers themselves to be quite isolated and autonomous, but actually, of course, they are affected by policies and outcomes and other ongoings within the organization, and then the organization itself, of course, has very permeable membranes to suppliers and customers and regulations and all the rest of it, even though they may consider themselves to be quite isolated from it.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just mention two or three more. In lots of natural systems, we tend to have what we call distributed control. So I mentioned the kind of flock of birds already. There is no one controlling that flock of birds. There is no one telling that flock of birds, you now need to make a a shape that looks like a top hat. Somehow that top hat shape just comes out of the interactions that they have with each other at a local level. That's all about, and is the case that in a lot of nature you have this very distributed control. And again, just to make the kind of link for you to management thinking or economic thinking, I would say a lot of what teal thinking or self-management or holacracy talks about is actually precisely kind of trying to emulate some of this distributed control. How can we delegate the decisions kind of down, as it were, the hierarchy, to the kind of local people who are actually going to use it, and how does that then kind of affect the organization and what emerges from that. And two more things. One is I've already touched on. We need to. Most systems are far too complex for us to be able to predict what's going to happen. If you're dealing with human systems, they are almost invariably complex. We need to kind of, in many situations, not in all situations, but in many situations, become much less intent on trying to predict and plan and then kind of roll out, what's going to happen. And we need to become much more comfortable about this kind of idea of how do I experiment and see what works and then amplify that. Again, to make a kind of connection to management and so on, something that people may be much more comfortable talking about is agile. That kind of way of working is actually not a million miles away from agile methodologies, where again, you test, you kind of put it to the user, you see what happens, you see what the users tell you. If it works, you kind of build on it. If it doesn't, you kind of go back to the drawing board and start again. And then the last thing that I'll maybe say is that systems learn, and kind of learning is a really key part of a lot of systems. And the way that systems learn is that they interact. There's a kind of combination of the inside and the outside of the system. And this is kind of very critical. You kind of, a system will learn by changes happening in its environments, by pressure happening, something therefore being different. But that will then actually only lead to learning in that system if something structural in that system changes. So simplistically, I don't know, in a human cell, something in its environment might change. It might get starved of some kind of nutrient or something. In that human cell, something then changes at the molecular level. Something gets built, some kind of molecule that can generate what it needs, or something gets changed, or some switch gets flicked, or whatever. Unless that happens, learning doesn't occur. So it's a combination of the inside and the outside. If you only have the outside and a reaction in the cell, but that structural change doesn't happen, learning hasn't occurred. And that also kind of speaks a little bit, again, I'm jumping around, but I'm just trying to draw parallels to you, to things that you might have heard of or that I think relate and are interesting. The kind of whole nature and nurture, debate. We can always say, well, is it the DNA or is it the environment that kind of, makes you what you are? Actually, from systems thinking, the answer is that it is genuinely actually both. Because your DNA won't actually won't change unless you have pressure from the outside, but equally vice versa is true as well. So these are the kind of parts of systems thinking that I'm kind of interested in, which in some ways, I mean, you'll see there maybe feel a little bit less tangible, but they to me also feel a little bit more fundamental about how we see the world and how we view things. And in my case, I'm particularly interested in how we view organizations, as opposed to, what sometimes can be a slightly more mechanistic interpretation, which often has come from, things like systems dynamics and cybernetics and so on, which I think can sometimes get misappropriated into kind of being yet another problem-solving tool. So how can systems thinking actually help us genuinely kind of see things differently and make connections in other ways?
So Tom, what I might suggest we do, just I want to leave enough time for a little bit of interaction and questions shortly. I think the how we change systems is probably the spot that people are quite intrigued by, and maybe have tried and struggled to see how some of the theory works in practice. So maybe we can just switch a little bit to what does it mean to think about changing systems? These are pretty damn complex. Can they be changed?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some ideas or tools that you use or you know are quite effective.
Mm-hmm.
And while we do that, I'm going to put something in the chat which I found quite useful. It's very simplistic, but it's quite a neat visual around the iceberg model, which helps us understand things that underlie the obvious, the tip of the iceberg. But what is it that's beneath that maybe we can, if we spend more time looking at? So I'll put that in the chat. People can look at that. But maybe you could start that just sort of thinking about or talking about the changing systems question.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll start with where you're starting with the iceberg model, which is, if you haven't come across it, it's a kind of change model that comes, I believe, originally kind of from organizational change. And it is the idea that, only 10% of the iceberg is above the water and is visible. And that is usually what we observe. That is what happens. That is the events. That is the occurrence. But 90% below, you have several layers that kind of, as you go down, you go from the events, which you can observe. The next layer down is what's called patterns, which are kind of recurring events. Below that is the structures. And even below that is the kind of the worldview and the mindsets. You might sometimes talk about it as being culture. I sometimes kind of use shorthand of values for that as well. And it's a fairly, I think, widely acknowledged kind of principle of systems change. If you genuinely want to change a system, that's not going to happen unless you manage to get to that lowest level of kind of mindsets and worldview change. Unless you can start getting people to think about their values and adapt and change their values, you're not actually going to be able to kind of change those higher levels of patterns and events that happen. You might be able to do it temporarily. You might be able to force a change, or you might be able to kind of catalyze a change for a little while. But like Charles was saying, it'll then probably just spring back, because unless the kind of underlying values and mindsets change, the change is not really sustainable. In systems language, people will say that the higher levels of the iceberg emerge from the lower levels, so that the structures emerge from the kind of mindset and values, the patterns emerge from the structures, and the events emerge from the patterns that we see. So that's I think probably one really key and important thing to think about in systems change. The one other thing I'll just mention more briefly, because I think it relates a little bit to some of the questions that were answered at the start, is that this is something that I was taught by people who know much more about this than I do. But if we want to be creating systems change, and I guess this is kind of, we're now talking societal level systems change, let's say, you actually need always to have change happening at multiple levels at the same time. It's not going to happen if you kind of target one level, So I guess in the kind of economic organizational context, if you target one organization, that's going to be difficult. If there isn't also change happening at the industry level, if there isn't also some kind of zeitgeist thing going on where societal or economic level things are changing as well, these, unfortunately, these stars kind of have to slightly align. Otherwise, I think you are also going to get into that situation where you think you've changed something and then it just kind of springs back because the other things round about it haven't also made a change as well. In turn, I guess that also means that, unfortunately, it's probably quite difficult for any one of us or any one of our organizations or even coalition of organizations to bring about systems change by themselves. Maybe that goes without saying. But, it does mean that it's always going to have to be quite a kind of widespread coalition of organizations and people and movements working at all kinds of different levels at the same time.
But it relates a little bit to a question, I think it was Adam who asked before, how does one person kind of really effectively, how does one person make a difference if they have a strong view and they want to change the system? I guess we're seeing evidence of this increasingly in various aspects of society, but I think this concept of advocacy and movement building and activism are in their own way achieving some of these outcomes. And whilst you said, I think you've got to try and get alignment in the events, but also in the underlying values and some of the structural aspects, but movement building and advocacy and creating connections, looking for like thinking and being pretty active about it is probably one area I would say is proving to be quite effective. It doesn't take 50% of people to move. It only takes a relatively, still a lot of people in some cases, but a relatively small amount of momentum to then start the ball moving. So I think there's relevance to what you were just saying.
And the other thing that I would say about that kind of individual change, and I remember watching a talk again by Donella Meadows. She would just say, just keep asking those difficult questions. And for me, I would say the difficult questions are the ones that, because of what we just discussed about the iceberg, the difficult questions are the ones that question the values. Why is it that we always need to have growth? Why do we have to grow? Why is that even necessary? So one thing is to do that, is to keep asking those difficult questions and chipping away at, why do we believe that? I mean, this actually doesn't really make sense, and a kind of infinitely growing economy is just stupid. Actually, it's just that we don't ask ourselves that question enough. And the second one is to spotlight, which I find very useful, is to spotlight, in my case, organizations, or it might be individuals or whatever, who are already operating according to a different set of values. I think this is one thing. We've got John on the call, that the B Corp movement is really great at, is kind of spotlighting organizations that are trying to and are wanting to and operating according to a different set of values. And by spotlighting those organizations, or it might be individuals or movement makers or whatever, I'm using organizations because that's what we work on, you kind of normalize that, and you kind of go, oh yeah, we could actually work a little bit more like that ourselves, couldn't we? Why don't we do that? But again, the important thing is to kind of, for me, I think, is to see the organizations, again, the phrases that are in a way operating according to a different set of values, that are kind of being slightly countercultural in that sense, and kind of, pointing at those and going, they're doing that. It's, their world hasn't suddenly disappeared. They're still in business. Why don't we do a bit more like that? That seems like a great idea. And that immediately also kind of gives a lot of credibility as well.